So, welcome everybody. Today we have our webinar on behaviour management or behaviour support. So how do we support people through relational practice? Why this topic now? For us at SPA, we've been increasingly concerned about the growing trend of using control and punishment to control children, and we're particularly worried about how that might affect the more marginalised children in our society. In England, the Education Secretary has recently been very much promoting this discipline and order approach, and he has said, and you can find this on the DFE website, we're going on a discipline drive in schools, and he cites this Michaela, which is a school in North London, which is Britain's strictest schools, where reading and writing are conducted in silence, and pupils are given demerits for things like forgetting their pens or slouching in class. And he wants this kind of culture to be the norm. So this is where we sort of started off this idea of thinking around how can we support this a different way, because we're not sure that that helps. So we're very lucky today to have three fantastic presentations from different parts of the world, indeed. So we're going to start with hearing from Simon Johr. Simon, could you just wave?
Hello.
Earlier. He's one of the SPA trustees, social pedagogue and social worker who works in Coventry. He's going to talk about how he and his team have helped the fostering service to really transform how they see behaviour and how they support foster carers to support children with their behaviour. Then we have Joe Gibb. Joe, could you give a little wave? Thank you. And Joe is from Compass Child and Family Services in North Ayrshire in Scotland, which is a residential service. And he's going to be talking about how the philosophies of care and the theories there translate into practice, into residential practice, and telling a wee story. So we always love a good story. And then we have Laura.
Hello.
Who has researched behaviour support and has done a lot of research into physical restraint, restrictive physical interventions, and has recently, or over the last few years, has really developed this idea of threshold concepts. And so we're very, very honoured to have Laura here linking all of these things together and with threshold concepts. So after that, we'll have a short time for questions and answers. So if you've got any questions, jot them down either in the chat box. I'll be trying to keep an eye on that as we go. And we'll have a short space of time for that. And then, because we're really keen on making sure that learning transforms our practice and we put our learning into practice, then we'll have 20 minutes for breakout room discussions, and we'll have a Jamboard. I'll explain later if you're not familiar with the Jamboard, to figure out what have we learned, what would we want to do with that learning. So I hope that that's all good for everybody. Wonderful that you're all here. Thank you very much for being part of this this fantastic webinar. And I'm now going to just check on everybody. Does anybody have anything that they need right now? If you do, please pop it into the chat box. We are slightly, I think we're slightly ahead of time, which is rather unusual for us. So, Simon, I'm going to hand over to you and make sure that you have the sharing option.
Yes, I think it does work. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see all your faces and your names. So my name is Simon Johr. I'm originally a German-trained social pedagogue, and I'm practicing now for 8 years here in the UK. I'm currently employed by Coventry City Council, where I'm part of our fostering team, and my responsibility is our Next Step scheme, which is our specialist fostering scheme. So these are foster carers who take on children where I would say the majority of our foster carers normally would say, oh, there is a very troubled background. I would have some reservations of taking on this child because I'm not sure if I can deal with what they might bring into the home. So when I started this job in 2018, I was also asked to rewrite, update our training course that existed before on managing challenging behavior. And well, for me as a social pedagogue, when I just heard that title, I had let's say a hint of kind of how this training was run previously, and I thought I would like to go away from the purely managing of the challenging behavior to really understanding where the behavior is coming from, what are the underlying reasons, what are the experiences that children had in their early childhood that led to them now displaying this behavior. But what does this behavior mean? So these are all the things I really want to explore. And what I'm going to show you now are a few slides from the actual course, which I think kind of represent what my colleague and I are doing in our training course, and which hopefully gives you a short glimpse of the content. So we always start with these two quotes because that I want to really emphasize that we're here to understand the behavior. So the first quote I always present is from Sigmund Freud. A thing which has not been understood inevitably reappears. Like an unlaid ghost, it cannot rest until the mystery has been solved and the spell broken. And then you see here a second quote, which is from the American psychologist Dr. Dave Siegler, and I use his materials at different points throughout the course. And I include this quote always because I find it so wonderfully realistic. Because he says that there are no quick fixes. All we can really achieve is hard-earned accomplishments, success over time. And I think that's important to say because sometimes I notice that people come to training courses and have very high expectations. So I like to set it out by saying, okay, we can make changes here. Well, it's a long process because we're working with people, we're working with relationships, and that is doesn't happen overnight. So then we always lie on the kind of the ground rules of the training course that we want to run it very interactive. And I think the interactive part is something which was tricky to take over from the classroom version, which we had until obviously March last year. And now we have a virtual version. We have condensed a little bit of time, but we keep the interactive parts. So I think it's very important at the beginning to always stop people from just switching off. So we try to take over as many interactive activities, and we just found online ways of doing that. And one way what we do at the beginning is we do this group discussion where we put people in different breakout rooms and we ask them what is challenging behavior, because we don't want to give them a definition of what that includes, because we really want that the people develop themselves an understanding of actually what is challenging behavior for one person. It's not necessarily what is challenging behavior for someone else. So it's very, very individual, and it's actually a person at the receiving end who defines what is challenging, not so much the person who is actually displaying the behavior. So, and we reflect on that, we reflect on the impact, and we see what did the people bring on the course with them. So we also use this model, which to a lot of you will be familiar. It's the social pedagogical learning zone model. In general, I think the course is very much underpinned by social pedagogical thinking. However, this I think is the most overt way of displaying that. So we use this model here to reflect with the people about, you know, when are they in the comfort zone, and then children in care, when are they in their comfort zone, when they're in their panic zone, what are the triggers, and how can we really help and support the children to get into the learning zone, to grow the comfort zones bigger. And then we compared it to another model, the window of tolerance, which I think there's a huge overlap between these two models. And I think it's also important to show people that a lot of models overlap and they're not contradicting each other. So this is succeeding at all the wrong things. I don't like the words right and wrong so much, but this is how Dave Siegler puts it, and that's why I'm using it. And what I really like about his idea, that he portrays children who display challenging behaviors as what you can read here. He says, if you do a tantrum multiple times every day, actually you're very committed, hardworking, persistent, and a tireless champion at doing this. So you have a lot of actually positive attributes, but you're investing them just in a not very positive way. So, and what we want to encourage our foster care is to help the child and the child's brain to realize that she can invest all this energy, but in a different direction. So, and what that leads us into is really to a lot of discussions about trauma and the brain. So we talk a lot about brain development, about what happens to the young brain when it's exposed to very negative, adverse childhood experiences. We're looking at different research, we're looking at different materials, we talk about the limbic system and how the brain develops, and what can go wrong when traumatic events occur, and what impact that has on the children, on their childhood, on how they develop. And we talk a lot about kind of the different behaviors you can actually see that link to trauma. And I think one book, if you can see that, which I find really, really helpful for this course, it's called Wide in the Window from Elizabeth Stanley. And in here, what I always read out, what I always show people is, she has 8 pages here where she just presents all the different symptoms of dysregulation a person with trauma can have. And they're so varied, from cognitive symptoms, physiological, emotional, also spiritual symptoms and behavioral symptoms. And it just gives you such a huge bandwidth of behaviors where a lot of people would say, oh, this is a behavior, but I would not have connected that this actually could be rooted in trauma. So we try to really get a wider understanding of how trauma can look like. And that is a very individual thing. How every brain deals with these experiences, and how the body is trying to protect themselves. And there's these different symptoms of dysfunction are just a mirror of what happened inside them. And we also point out this is a natural response. It's physiological. It's not psychological. It's a natural response to an overwhelming event in someone's life. And also from this book, I took on this graph, which for me, I think when I first saw it, I thought this is really something where I had a light bulb moment, because in the past I always saw like there is a kind of normal state we're in, and then there's stress, and there's trauma, and I saw it as quite separate things. And here you see it's a continuum. Where on the one end you start as very bored, and then you get into more activity, and you see there's a peak performance. And we all know that when we are a little bit stressed, that actually we're pushing ourselves forward, we are at the most efficient. But we all know that if we pushed every day, there comes the point when it's too much, and then we get burned out and really stressed. And so it's a continuum, and we all move there every day. We're in different places in this continuum, and the trauma is at the very end of that. Also in the course, we have a lot of case studies. So here, that's, for example, a very interesting YouTube video we watched of a lady in Scotland who adopted a child, and how she supported the child with her husband, and the problems she faced when she wanted to explain her school, to take into account the early childhood experience of the child. For example, she asked them, please don't draw family trees, this could trigger him, and things like that. And we talk about how that actually went. It didn't go very well at that time. So we look at different, so we try to identify the trigger of the child, and how this could have been avoided. Then we have a little bit of fun. We watch a little bit of a movie. I think there's a lot of things in popular culture where you can actually see trauma displayed. Or here, in this case, we talk about the connection between trauma and child development, attachment. And yeah, I think Mr. Scrooge, there's very obvious that he has some attachment problems in his childhood, but there are also various other media you can analyze. For example, Harry Potter, all the three main characters have different attachment styles. So if you look into this, you can do some really fun analysis, but also learn from that. And then we also want to root the whole conversation with our participants into the wider culture. So to not just say this is an individual thing, this is just the individual persons and their experience. We also want to look at what is the impact of our culture? How violent is our culture? How violent is a media? And to really look at, okay, where is violence coming from, and why are people violent, and how do they learn that behavior, and how can you work with that? Because I think the conversation about violence is very important, because that's, I think, what our carers find the most difficult to deal with. And then we're introducing nonviolent communication. We introduced the 4 basic steps of it, and we give our participants cards about feelings and needs, and we encourage them to use this to emphasize with the child they have in their care, to maybe take a specific situation, and to look at, what is this child feeling, and what is he needing because he's feeling in a certain way. And we encourage them to use this as a kind of reflective tool to understand their children better. And then we also look at what NVC is saying about where is violence coming from, how is that taught in one's socialization, and how can you work with this now. And finally, towards the end, we're also looking at other ways to help people with trauma to process it. And we also here, we look both at what's happening in the brain. We're looking at the vagus nerve in the brain, and at the nervous system, and we're seeing what trauma does. And one way that is to help someone with trauma is the system needs to calm down, and they need to piece the different puzzle pieces of the trauma together, and mindfulness techniques, breathing techniques, that is really soothing and calming. But we also encourage people to make a list of other things their individual children might find relaxing, might find calming, so to help them to develop their own reservoirs of ideas, what they can actually do for the children to help them to overcome the trauma over time, and again focusing on, you know, their relationship to them. Because I think one important message is that trauma is not the end. Something can be done, and if you have a significant person in your life like a foster carer, this is such a big help to overcome this event. So we really encourage people, you can be this wonderful person who makes the difference, and we just want to give people, you know, some tools that they can take away and implement in their practice. So that was a quick snapshot what we do in our course. I hope you find it interesting, and if you have some questions later, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Lots of really interesting food for thought there, particularly like the on how violent is our culture. And I think part of the reason that we're here is that we see in SPA, we see quite a behaviourist approach, which is replicated with the English Department for Education, but this idea that behaviourism is the best way that we can help children is rather counteracting to what we believe in social pedagogy and what the research says. So I'm very happy now to introduce Joe Gibb, who's going to talk about how using a behaviour support approach has been influenced by social pedagogy at Compass. Over to you, Joe. Joe, you might need to unmute yourself.
Sorry guys, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep, great. Thanks, Robin. So my name's Joe Gibb. I'm a residential service manager at Compass Child and Family Services, and we run a small children's house in North Ayrshire. So this presentation is going to look at using a behaviour support approach influenced by the social pedagogy perspective. So, there we go. So a bit about myself. So I'm the residential services manager at Compass at Teagarroch. That's the name of the house, and that stands for Nurture House in Gaelic. I'm married, got 3 children. Done a bit of boxing in my youth, but I wasn't that great, but I still loved it. Enjoy football and weight training, and my kind of background in terms of education, I've got a BA in community education. I've got child protection postgrad qualification, and also a master's in residential childcare. So we've got a bit of a unique situation going on because we have got international links with 2 organisations, one in Ireland called Compass Child and Family Services Ireland and KJSH in Germany. So there's representatives of both organisations who sit on our board, and pretty much for us that gives us a really good kind of international flavour, and the guys can contribute to our training, especially when it comes to social pedagogy. So my hopes, basically having presented this, is that you get curious and get into problem pose. You know, and it kind of basically, as Freire says, in problem posing education, people develop their own powers to perceive critically the way they exist in the world in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as static reality, but as a reality in process and transformation. So I'm not going to give you 100 answers here, but it's just pretty much hopefully you go away kind of, you know, asking some questions to yourselves and each other. So our philosophy of care emphasises behaviour support as a key, and social pedagogy is behind that. And you know, sometimes social pedagogy as a perspective can be quite a difficult kind of perspective to pin down in terms of what it means. But in the most kind of like simplistic form, and this is kind of from Pat Petrie, is it's using education in its widest sense to help improve society. So for us, we've developed an acronym called CC Helper, and pretty much that helps us kind of frame our practice in terms of our objectives. So in every situation, we seek to understand the context behind it. We use the common third pretty much on a regular basis, and we use head, heart and hands to inform our practice, and we pretty much use an ethical stance in Haltung, and the life space is where we do our work, and we really kind of use the personal, professional and private elements of the carer's role whilst promoting children's rights and human rights. So for us, in terms of our training, we receive some introductory training when we start with Compass, and pretty much the first cohort of carers get some really kind of good training from, it was some colleagues from Ireland and also Germany. So, and pretty much in the second cohort, Robin Kemp also provided some training, and pretty much through that training, the key thinkers, as seen on the screen, have been really threaded through it. So Pestalozzi, Freire, Hahn, Montessori and Korczak. And alongside that, we've, within our own training out with the introductory training, we've started kind of to tease out, you know, what does social pedagogy look like in Scotland? And is there any key thinkers or philosophers that kind of chime with the perspective? And for us, at the very kind of early stages of a mapping process, we've identified that David Hume is someone who influenced Immanuel Kant, for example, who influenced social pedagogy. So pretty much we're trying to claim social pedagogy has been pretty much part Scottish, which is a bit cheeky, but I think there's certainly a real mileage in that. And Hume kind of suggests that knowledge is gained only through experience, and the experiences only exist in the mind as an individual units of thought. And that's quite a nice kind of wee quote. In addition to that, we're looking at social pedagogy and pretty much behaviour support through a sociological lens. And Ray Oldenburg, who's an urban sociologist, suggests that society's, you know, got a bit of a challenge at the moment, and also back in 1989, because of the lack of the third place. And that's pretty much, you know, in terms of leisure and activity-based stuff. And for us, when we're working with children and their families, that the activity element of you know, getting to know each other is crucial. And from that, it's really key that we need to kind of do our best to emphasise that you know, the healing takes place not only in the house but outside in the wider world. And during the pandemic, you could probably kind of get to understand that that can be a bit more challenging, but we've still managed to get some really good outcomes for our kids. And Everybody's favourite theorist within child and youth care and social pedagogy, Urie Bronfenbrenner, he really influences the Scottish national practice model, and for us it's really crucial that we recognise Bronfenbrenner in terms of his ecological systems theory. And two really kind of well-known quotes that can really help us kind of, inform our practice is, the first one is, every child needs an adult that's crazy about them, and the second one is, child and youth care, or in this instance social pedagogy, isn't rocket science, it's more complicated than that. And when you put the two essentially quotes together, you come to kind of realise that actually, as much as it looks easy in terms of engaging in relational practice, there's really a lot going on behind the scenes, and also, you know, that mainly takes place in the microsystem, but also can be influenced at the macro, at policy level. And also for us, critical theory, because of Scotland's history, we've also kind of introduced a wee bit of critical theory in terms of how we kind of frame our approach with carers as well. Introduce them to that critical theory and how education is supposed to be empowering, but for example, Johr suggests that it can be the opposite and can actually, you know, pretty much chain people to society rather than let them go and be free. And that's something that Johr is really passionate about, is having an education approach that essentially enables us to operate within the borderlands in an effort to challenge the evils of neoliberalism or other kind of viewpoint that is capitalism. And finally, in terms of for this presentation, I must kind of point towards a sociologist called Adorno and Horkheimer, who talk about the impact of the cultural industry and how that, for us, supports how we support behaviour, but also keeps our mind's eye on some of the challenges. So, for example, back in the 50s, when these guys were kind of like theorising, we were talking about the impact on American society by the media, and that is very kind of apt in this day and age when you think about social media for all our society and how that impacts on children and families, sometimes positively, but also sometimes negatively. And then the other kind of side of that is how the culture industry impacts on how we support children's behaviour in terms of residential childcare. When you think about the abuse discourse and essentially, how the media portray residential childcare, that can impact on how we support children's behaviour because of how we are promoted within the media. So, for example, we're always deemed to be the placement of last resort. Poor outcomes, there's various abuse scandals, and most notably in Scotland, the Johr inquiry. Societal views of children in general are pretty much, depends where we are, but at the moment it's children of the underclass still. Staff are generally trained poorly, and placements are deemed to be of high cost and of low value of return. And Brodie Patterson suggests that residential childcare is the fourth emergency service. So essentially, when everything else fails, children come into care. And for this purpose, I've used the wee case study very quickly, and I've named this child Dorian, and pretty much it's purely coincidental, but some of the kind of themes in Dorian's life will pretty much be quite kind of common to some of us, because it is a common story. Dorian's early life wasn't idyllic, as the picture suggests. Although not fully known, Dorian had been exposed to a range of diversities from a young age. During infancy, Dorian's mother gave Dorian up, and Dorian went to live with extended family. Sadly, Dorian was removed after 2 years. Age 5, Dorian had been in foster care twice. Both placements broke down. Whilst in foster care, Dorian was being restrained frequently. School was a real challenge too. Exact figures are unknown, however, Dorian was restrained at least once per day whilst in school and twice per week within foster care, and that's probably been underreported. Age 5, Dorian was reluctantly placed in residential care for the first time, and Dorian's social worker because they couldn't find anywhere else. After a year of living in residential childcare, Dorian's story is quite a positive one. Dorian was matched with a loving foster family and is now doing well. So at Compass, we've supported children like Dorian with similar backgrounds, and currently we have 2 Dorians that I'm calling them, one who is young and one who's a little older. I actually write about the first Dorian in an article that was published last year, and I've included the link to that in this in the chat box, and I'd really encourage you to read at it. So it's been quite positive for both Dorians, and there's been a 97% reduction in damage to property based on previous placements, especially for the older Dorian, and a 99% reduction in running away. There's also been a 98% reduction in physical restraint and a 99% reduction in police involvement. There's been improved relationships with carers, improved school experience for the younger child, and access to wider community activities for the younger child as well, and not so much for the older child, but it's doing not so bad. And there's been a significant reduction in risk in both children's lives, and there's also signs that children are recovering from trauma. So we've done that by using a social pedagogy approach to support positive behaviour, and our approach to practice is multi-layered and is fully embedded in the different levels of our service. Social pedagogy is kept alive within our service by integrating the perspective into things such as training, our recruitment and induction, policies and procedures, our mission statements, and the language we use with children and families, and how we write in communication documents as well. The environment and having experience on tap and listening to experts by experience, so essentially listening to children and their families. We have regular team meetings and reflective practice, and we use a transformative leadership style and more. So we also use a strength-based approach in terms of supporting behaviour, and we really do look at the ecological perspective in terms of trying to work out, what the strengths are within a children's own life, and capitalise upon that. And we look at this bit of research by Hopkins in 2019 was published, and it's about 7 positive experiences that can help overcome adversity. And in analysing these 7, the younger child has pretty much hit 7 of these, whilst the older child hits 5. And pretty much the older child's having a great experience at school, and has minimal connection with friends, but online friendships are quite strong, but they do have their challenges. And here we come to one of our carers. This is Tina. And pretty much Tina's been with us from the very start, and she has been instrumental in supporting our younger Dorian and where that child currently is in the child's life. And pretty much it really started from the beginning when we first got notification that Dorian was going to come and live to us. Tina was identified as the person responsible and going to be the key worker. And from that, Tina sent a letter, and you can see that at the top, a wee kind of extract of the letter, whereby Tina put some pictures in it, very quite pedagogical in her writing, and used her head, heart and hands to construct that, and put some pictures in it about her and her love for horses, and a couple of pictures of her dogs. And when Doreen arrived, Tina was there to greet her at the door, and that really sparked, the beginnings of a really powerful relationship that continues to this day. And pretty much there has been a lot of bumps in the road along the way, but as I said earlier, it's been a really kind of positive time for Doreen, to the extent where she's really developed some really kind of lovely hobbies, including football. She's really engaging in the community, and to the extent where now she's taken up horse riding. She's been doing it for a while, and she's learning to ride. And here's a very, well, it's not quite a short clip. Initially, first we'll talk about, just Tina's values, in respect to her values mirror the values of the organisation, and that's pretty much it. She offers hope, she offers love, rights, respect, opportunity, and lasting happiness. And because of that, Doreen has really kind of moved forward in her life. And pretty much we do use the scaffold approach and the zone of proximal development, and we positively risk take as well, and that really helps children learn, grow and develop, especially in a Scottish kind of culture that can be risk averse, to the extent where the common third is used extensively. And here's an example of a common third experience, and this is only a very short clip, but it demonstrates essentially where Doreen is at the moment. That took a long time to get to that stage, and the video that's longer really kind of highlights how she's come on leaps and bounds. And pretty much our argument is that residential childcare is a specialist social educational field of practice, and it needs to be kind of viewed as that within the wider field and also wider society. And that's pretty much a threshold concept that I know that Laura's going to talk about. And in addition to that, what I would suggest is you are and we need to be border educators. The real strength for us has been the fact that we've been operating not just in the silos of a house or in the community where the house is situated, but we've also been doing extensive work with the families of both children. And in that respect, Kazajin suggests as border pedagogy is a multicultural educational approach, utilising multicultural settings to help carers understand their histories and experiences and how it affects their identities and cultures. The approach seeks to produce intellectuals that transcend physical and metaphysical boundaries. And that's what I'm pretty much, we at Compass are trying to suggest, that the work not only takes place within the house, but also in the wider community. And that is really reflected in the 10 principles of family support, in which the promise, which came from the National Childcare Review in Scotland, suggests that support needs to be community-based, responsive and timely, need to work with family assets, we need to promote empowerment and agency and be flexible, holistic and relational, therapeutic, non-stigmatising, patient and persistent, and it's got to be underpinned by children's rights. And we feel that at the moment at Compass we're actually kind of doing that. And from that, it's a bit about we are a small but important cog in a big wheel and can help to achieve great things. And it's for us as practitioners to remember that. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. That's a whistle-stop tour of many things. But I particularly like what we're trying to do in the UK is to form our own UK paradigm of social pedagogy. And so definitely it's lovely to see David Hume in there. But also other theorists like Johr and Adorno and Horkheimer. Awesome stuff there. And Joe made a lovely little link through to Laura talking about threshold concepts. So Laura, can I hand over to you?
Right, sorry, my clock has disappeared, so I'm gonna grab a watch. Okay, great, yes, what a nice launch pad, thank you, Joe. You also had something in there, I don't know if you did that deliberately, but use the word intellectual in one of your last slides, and argued recently that what I was arguing was about residential childcare, but I'll expand it to social pedagogical work is intellectual work. And by that, I don't mean that we all have to wear horn-rimmed glasses and wear black polo necks, but it means that we have to apply our intellect to do that. And that, you know, we do bump into a lot of anti-intellectualism, both in terms of kind of a fear around that from within our own quarters, and a lack of appreciation for the intellectual endeavor that is required to really understand what's going on for children, young people, and families when they're struggling. And so what a nice way in, because I was just gonna say, you rarely hear that word in relation to our work, and yet it should be there. Okay, so I'm going to try to turn the conversation to threshold concepts a bit, and do that within 15 minutes. So I want to start just by talking about the lenses through which we see and understand, whether that's quote unquote challenging behavior or other aspects of our work. And trauma is a very dominant lens, and similar to how when you look through a microscope, you can see things in a way that you can see things that you couldn't see before when you look through the lenses of a microscope. Similarly, we should be looking for and actively using lenses that help us to see things differently or more clearly so that we can be of more help. And trauma is a dominant one, and I expected to see stuff on trauma today, which I did, although it wasn't as dominant as it seems to be in the wider field, which is actually not a bad thing. I think trauma has a lot of explanatory power. I want to shift the focus a bit toward relationships as a lens through which to make sense of how we support children who have behaviors that we struggle with. And then look at the lenses through which we look at relationships. So there is broad agreement across social pedagogy, child and youth care, which is the North American umbrella under which residential childcare sits, which is my background, and social work, which is the umbrella under which residential childcare is mostly situated, although that's changing. And there's interesting things at the borderlands of that, actually. And yet, despite this broad agreement, there is around what constitutes a good relationship, or how you do relationships, to use a sociological use of the word do, is absent or underdeveloped, especially how to do relationship with people who've been hurt badly by relationship and have very good reason to resist engaging in a relationship with you. And yet I guess I'll put my cards on the table. I think we can't think about behavior without thinking about it within this wider context of relational practice, relationship-based practice, however you use language around that. I think more widely there's conflicting forces and messages, and the quotes that you had at the beginning, Robin, I think they come from a wider neoliberal project within which a much more managerialist way of thinking about what we need to do to get people to do what we want them to do through processes of performance management. And it's even now filtering down to children with that quote. And so I don't think it's coincidental. I think there's a wider political economic project that has its fingerprints all over that. And we could do a whole day on that, but I'll stop there. I also think that I'm going to call it pain-based behavior, and this comes from Jim Anglin, and I mentioned this in the papers that this is based on, and the papers are linked at the back, and I'm happy to provide the slides. So Anglin talks about pain-based behavior in terms of the underlying psychosocial pain that kids are in, and his grounded theory study of what makes for effective residential childcare, he found that pain-based behavior was often, or the underlying pain was often glossed over and not adequately recognized, surprisingly so for even services that were functioning at a high level. And certainly the pain of working with people who are in pain that causes us as carers was definitely not addressed at all. And so I've had people tell me that just the term pain-based behavior they feel is threshold, and thinking about behavior in that way. I'm not necessarily saying we shouldn't ever call it anything else, but it's just a taster for that. But what is threshold? So threshold concepts I'm going to offer just as a lens, another lens for understanding relational practice and working with challenging behavior within relational practice. And so to be able to do that, I need to tell you a bit about threshold concepts. And I'm going to be a bit brief here, and I'm going to be even briefer when I tell you about the study. But again, if you want to know more, the slides will be available to you, and I'm happy to share the papers with you. They're behind paywall, but I'll just send it to you, and I won't go on a rant about academic publishing and the outrageous profit margins that are happening there. Okay, so threshold concepts. Originally, it was just defined, so any subject matter or discipline has its core concepts. And so it is a type of core concept that has added qualities to it. And there's going to be a bullet coming up that says this, but I think it's worth repeating, so I'm going to say it now. We don't necessarily need to think of it as nice, neat, tidy concept. It can be an area of learning or an area of practice as well, or in addition to nice, neat core concepts. But once you really start to get your head around this threshold concept or area of practice, it opens up new ways of thinking. And so much of today has been about ways of thinking. And for as long as I can remember, I've been advocating that if we want to be of use to children and young people when they're in pain or struggling, then how we think is the most important thing that will determine how well we respond. And so the way that we think is tremendously important in all of this. So a threshold concept can be thought of as a portal or threshold, hence the name, to another level of thinking and practicing. I also want to introduce the notion of liminality here, that when you're going through this thresholding process of getting your head around some concept or area of learning or area of practice, that you go through this period of liminality where you're not there yet. And in fact, sometimes we mimic understanding before we actually have that understanding. And often it's easier to identify in other people. So if you can think of people you've worked with who thought they understood relational practice and they didn't at all, but they thought they did, and they were sort of mimicking it, but they weren't doing it in practice, that would be an example. But we all go through periods of liminality as we go through one level of understanding to a higher level of understanding. So the 5 characteristics that, in addition to them being core concepts or areas of learning, areas of practice of a given discipline are, and I'm going to just stress the first and last. So they're transformative. When you really get it, your thinking and your practice is transformed, and you can't go back. You can't forget it again. Although I'm interested in what happens with our kind of work when people are under extreme stress. So this, like, one of the first subject areas, special concept theory, was addressed to was economics. And so opportunity cost, which I remember trying to learn about as an undergraduate student, and I probably never fully got it. And maybe once you really get opportunity costs, it changes how you think about economic exchanges, and you never forget what that means or how that works, even if you come to not believe in it as a concept anymore. But I'm wanting to say that irreversible may be different in our kind of work than some others, but they definitely are integrated. When you get it, it helps you see the relationships between other aspects of your practice or other concepts or that sort of thing. They help to define a subject area. So this notion of border pedagogues and the borderlands really is about boundaries and about people who are at the edge or on the other side of the societal boundary when we socially exclude people. So it's really got me thinking about that. But in this case, they help to define a subject area. So for in child and youth care, I would say potentially life space is a threshold concept, and it really helps to define what makes child and youth care. And there's a little paper on that that's at the end too that might help. And importantly, they're troublesome. That like getting your head around it can be really hard. They can be counterintuitive or hard to grasp. I also argue in my paper that they're hard for other disciplines to grasp sometimes too. So the troublesomeness isn't always from within us as individuals or within us as a field, but sometimes the trouble comes from out with people who don't really understand social pedagogic practice, for example. So, so once threshold concepts are grasped, you go from a basic understanding, which is foundational, but then it begins to help your knowledge and your practice become more coherent, integrative, and that grasp of that threshold concept permeates new knowledge. And I've got a picture of a gas hob here because you start cooking on gas. And so threshold concepts have been studied for quite a while. They've become really quite an area of interest for educators and substantial empirical evidence. There's probably more since 2014, but at that time, there were the identification empirically of threshold concepts in at least 170 disciplinary or professional contexts. And only recently has it begun to be applied to residential childcare or child and youth care. And actually the study that I did in the literature foundation that I kind of made for it, I did incorporate some social pedagogy, but I didn't have the funding to also collect data from social pedagogy practitioners or educators. And if I can build on this, I think that's the next step. So they're not just concepts, as I said before, they're areas of learning, areas of practice. So the study, very briefly, I did focus groups with educators who had done some theory building and publication in the field, as well as educating in a dedicated child and youth care, residential childcare, therapeutic childcare setting, as well as practitioners who had taken a dedicated course in one of those things and had or were currently working in residential childcare. I also did follow-up individual interviews with practitioners around one threshold concept that had been identified in the focus group, which I'll tell you what that one was in just a second. And so this was an international, mainly transatlantic in terms of North America and the UK, but I also had some participants who had lived and practiced in either North America or the UK, but at the time of participating had since moved to New Zealand and Malta. So findings I'm going to be very brief about, but it gives you a flavor. These were some of the things that people identified, and you see relational practice, use of self as large boxes here, child development and developmental care, trauma makes a stage, attachment, containment, holding environments, and how to organize this was really very challenging. Not enough time to go into a lot of that. That was educators, this is practitioners, and I used color to also indicate. So the purple is the combination of the red and the blue. So things that educators had said that then practitioners also said, and they didn't get to hear what educators said until the end. And then they were able to scrutinize what the themes were that came out of the educators' focus groups. Anyway, so the purple are the ones that both groups had identified, but the sizing is related to what practitioners had identified. And the red were things that they identified that hadn't been. So again, relational practice, use of self came very largely, and behavior management and working with behavior, but you'll notice that that's in red because that wasn't identified specifically as a threshold area of practice. So findings, use of self was most prominently discussed across the educators focus group, and then relational practice was a close second. It flipped on the other side. So relational practice was discussed most prominently amongst practitioners. Use of self was also prominent amongst some of those other things. And this should make sense, both in terms of the dominant messages that practitioners are getting and educators are giving, but also the relationship. You can't really think too much about relationship without having to deal with yourself and how you bring yourself into that relationship. And when you start thinking about how you use yourself, it's hard not to think about relationships. So they're very integrated, the two. And there was greater degree of commonality than divergence between the two. And so just a couple of things to say about all this. There's unanimous agreement on the relevance of the 5 characteristics. So people talked about their experience of coming to acquire the higher level of knowledge and practice, or teaching it, or writing about it, or researching it. And one of the things that came out of the educator focus groups primarily, but it also came out of some of the practitioner ones, is this notion of the seemingly simple, in terms of, like, everybody knows what relational practice is, right? Like, but really, when you start peeling back the layers, and so sometimes people think they get it because it seems simple without dedicating the level of reflection necessary. And interestingly, reflection was mentioned by Simon, and a social work academic has identified reflective practice as a potential threshold concept, and I think she might be right as well. Some findings related to relational practice, that with the follow-up interviews, but I also went back and reanalyzed in relation to what people had to say about relational practice specifically. There were transformations in understanding of relational practice. So one of the most common things people talked about was seeing relationships as a means to an end when they first got into practice, like as a way to control kids and get kids to do what they wanted them to do, to relationship becoming an end in and of itself. And that's a very simplistic rendering. There's a lot more complexity into that, but I think that's quite recognizable to a lot of us. And maybe, like, I can remember when it was 2 of us with 18 kids, 9 boys, 9 girls, for the weekend, Friday night through to Monday morning. And I definitely thought about relationships as a way to keep things under control and safe. So, you know, we all had our threshold process with this. Boundaries came up a lot in the discussions, and some of that troublesome nature, like what makes relational concept troublesome to really grasp and get your head around. And 2 ways that I organized it under this heading of boundaries. One is this, like, how close is too close, and or not close enough, and what's professional and all of that. So relational proximity is the term that I gave for that, but just kind of managing closeness and distance in relationship. And I think when we then start thinking about attachment theory and co-regulation and borderline pedagogy, and the notion of how close is even more complex. We have mixed messages, sometimes misplaced messages coming from both within and externally about that, as well as, even if you really are well grounded in good principles and evidence base, to know how close or how distance and how to help a child manage closeness and distance is really difficult. And a lot of the troublesome behavior that we struggle with, I think, is rooted in that struggle around kids struggling with how close can I tolerate you being, but I really need you close. And then responding to pain-based behavior, and how do you set boundaries and limits in a way that has authority and allows people to feel safe, but isn't authoritarian. And I think that's hugely troublesome. And so, so much of what people had to say about relational practice could speak directly to how we begin to think about how we support our workers and our own development in this. The seemingly simple, I think, comes back into that as well. And often working with challenging behavior and the relational part of that is grossly simplified. And I'm not sure we're doing as much as we need to do to support people with that. And then finally, the relational nature of teaching and learning relational practice. I think if you're a manager or a trainer, thinking about that, the parallel that goes on with what kind of relational experiences are people having with us, that then supports the way they think about so like this morning, I had to meet with a student who had plagiarized his essay, and all of this was there writ large. And I had to think about what his experiences of relationship were going to be like through that process, through setting a limit around that, but also through being developmental through that would serve him well the next time he has to support a child who's made a poor choice. Okay, so what? How can thinking through all of this help us in adding another piece to this puzzle of how we do better with supporting kids and families who are struggling with pain-based behavior? I think awareness of ourselves and of other people, that we're all going through stages of liminality with this, and thinking about how do we create supportive spaces for people to get through those liminal spaces, and doing that with the same compassion for ourselves and one another that we want people to take to the children, but also with firmness. And then the parallels, which I've already begun to address. And further reading and references are there, and again, I'll make that available. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Perhaps we could show a little appreciation for our three speakers. There's a reaction button even at the bottom there. So yeah, thank you. What great food for thought that we have there. Particularly, I'm loving how troublesome all of these threshold concepts are, and your link to the political, how actually when we're thinking about behaviour, pain-based behaviour, again, is that perhaps another threshold, another way of seeing behaviour? So I'd love to now open it up to questions and comments from our wonderful audience. So if you'd like to join in or offer a question, please unmute yourself and I will try and manage this as best I can. Anybody here? Just thoughts, reflections. Anybody?
Jim Alexander has his hand up. You're waving, Jim. Did you want to ask something?
Yes, well, someone's got to say something. I thought it was very, very interesting, the three presentations. I found it very, we actually, I work at a Campbell school, which our ethos is social pedagogical. So when Joe was talking about the common third and the health tongue, that's everything that we do. And Joe has actually been to Oakle Tower at one point. So yeah, I find it very helpful. Although we do practices, it's always good to hear different, you know, a different take on it. And I found it very helpful. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Jim. It's good to hear that lots of these practices are being used. Any other thoughts, reflections?
I just wanted to say to Joe, I really liked in your presentation that you put that you were a failed boxer, because I actually think it's really powerful from a 3P's point of view to share things that we've failed at or not, you know, or just completely got wrong. And yeah, I do that quite a lot. I think I do it naturally without it being kind of purposeful, but also it's, you know, it is quite a good way of immediately kind of humanizing yourself and, you know, taking the tension out of the air, if you will. So thanks for that. Sorry your boxing career didn't work out.
We're kind of glad that you've landed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it also links to what Simon was saying, the quote that you were talking about with young people who are having many tantrums. We can see that as them being very committed, hardworking and persistent. It's just about the lens with which we see things, isn't it, Laura? I think, and for me, one of the biggest concepts for me was that 3Ps thing, that when I discovered that there was a third P, it allowed me to be personal, be boundaried in how I share who I am, but also understanding about how incredibly powerful the private P is and how that really takes over the more stress that we're under. So this thing about how do we support young people and through a relationship when someone's been so badly hurt through a relationship, as you were pointing out there, I think this really helps to figure out how to do that in the moment, because social pedagogy is about a way of thinking. A lot of Harbaugh talks about as you grow in your practice, you have more on the horizon to choose from, the things that you want to use in that particular moment. And I think that's one of those things that we can really benefit from, is really thinking through what do I have to draw on in this particular moment. We don't have to use everything. We need to use what's relevant and meaningful for that situation and the people within that situation. But I hear myself ranting on a little bit. Ranting Robin really should be put back in her box, and allow people a little time to go into breakout rooms and talk this through for yourselves. So
Andy is having a hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Andy.
Hi.
Hi, Andy. Nice.
Just thank you very much for the 3 presentations. Really enjoyed all 3. Laura, I'm really interested in terms of boundaries and how that can be misconstrued quite often. It's something that we have that kind of that push and pull with consistently here at Aberlour. You know, when people see boundaries as becoming authoritarian, or and so we're doing quite a bit of work with our clinical psychologists around that, in terms of kind of helping people understand kind of therapeutic parenting versus parenting, and how different it is. We can't be ordinary parents when we're working alongside our children and young people that have kind of had such difficult experiences growing up. So I just want to acknowledge that it's tough.
Actually, if I can just add that a former student of mine has written a really interesting paper on boundaries in residential childcare, and I'll give it to Robin. It's less about the limit setting kind of boundaries, and it's more about the interpersonal boundaries and emotional proximity stuff. But it's probably something worth reading, because it does start to roll up the sleeves, and it's one of the few empirical studies into the process. So that might be worth sharing as well.
Thank you.
Share all of this. We'll have a recording of this and share the presentation slides and any additional materials from this.